The wreckage in the void Danny Cole had been flying through the Kepler asteroid belt for nearly 6 hours when his scanner started beeping in a way he had never heard before. And he leaned forward in his old pilot chair to look at the screen with tired eyes that had seen too many long nights in the darkness of space, wondering what could possibly be making such a strange signal out here in the middle of nowhere, where only rocks and forgotten debris floated endlessly through the void. He was a salvage operator, which was a fancy way of saying he collected space junk for a living. And his ship was called the Wanderer because that was exactly what it did. It wandered from one asteroid field to another, picking up broken satellites and abandoned cargo containers and pieces of wrecked ships that nobody else wanted. And Danny would haul them back to the station and sell them for just enough credits to keep himself fed and his ship running for another month. Signal was coming from somewhere deep inside the asteroid field, past the spinning rocks and the clouds of dust that made navigation dangerous, even for experienced pilots. And Danny knew he should probably ignore it and keep moving because his fuel was running low and he had already spent too many days away from the station. But something about the signal felt different, felt important, felt like it was calling out for help in a language he could not understand but could somehow feel in his chest. Made his decision without thinking too much about it, turning the Wanderer toward the source of the signal and flying carefully between the tumbling asteroids, his hands steady on the controls even though his heart was beating faster than usual. And after 20 minutes of careful flying, he finally saw what was making the signal a ship, or what was left of one, shattered and broken and drifting through the darkness like a wounded animal that had crawled into a corner to die. Danny had never seen a ship like this before, not in all his years of salvage work, not in any database or catalog or manual he had ever read. And he realized with a shock that ran through his whole body that this was not a human ship at all, that the strange curves and unfamiliar metal and the soft golden glow coming from somewhere inside the wreckage all pointed to something he had only ever heard about in rumors and stories: an alien vessel. Actual proof that humanity was not alone in the universe. He should have called it in, should have contacted the authorities and reported his discovery and waited for someone more qualified to arrive. But then his scanner picked up something else, something that made his breath catch in his throat, a life sign. Weak and fading, but definitely there, somewhere inside that broken ship. And Danny knew that if he waited for help to arrive, it would probably be too late. The Wanderer was not built for rescue missions, not equipped with the right tools or the right medical supplies, or even the right kind of airlock for boarding a foreign vessel. But Danny had been improvising his whole life, and he was not about to stop now. So he brought his ship as close as he could to the wreckage and suited up in his old pressure suit that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt made of metal and plastic. Getting inside the alien ship was harder than he expected. The metal twisted and jagged and the corridors dark, except for the occasional flicker of dying emergency lights. And Danny moved slowly through the wreckage with his flashlight cutting through the shadows, following the faint signal from his handheld scanner toward the life sign that seemed to be getting weaker with every passing minute. He found her in what looked like it might have been a medical bay, surrounded by shattered equipment and sparking wires and pools of something that looked like blood but was the wrong color, a deep violet that seemed almost purple in the beam of his flashlight. And when he first saw her, he stopped moving entirely because she was the most extraordinary being he had ever seen in his life. She was tall, taller than any human woman he had ever met, with skin that was a pale silver blue color that seemed to shimmer slightly even in the dim light. And her eyes were closed, but he could see that they were large and almond-shaped. And her hair was long and white like fresh snow, spread out around her head like a halo against the dark floor. Her robes were torn and stained with that violet blood. And she was breathing, but only barely, each breath so shallow that Danny had to watch carefully just to make sure it was really happening. and he knew without any medical training that she was dying. That if he did not do something right now, she would be gone within the hour. He did not think about what she was, or where she came from, or what it would mean for humanity to make first contact with an alien species. He only thought about the fact that she was hurt and alone and needed help. And that was enough for him to kneel down beside her and carefully, gently, slide his arms under her body and lift her up. She was lighter than he expected. Or maybe the adrenaline pumping through his veins just made her feel that way. And he carried her back through the wrecked corridors and through the twisted metal and out through the gap he had cut in the hull, moving as quickly as he could without hurting her any more than she was already hurt. Getting her through the airlock and into the Wanderer was awkward and difficult. But Danny managed it somehow, laying her down on the narrow cot in his cargo bay that he used as a bed when he was too tired to make it back to his cabin. And then he sealed the airlock and got out of his pressure suit and started looking through his medical supplies for anything that might help. He had no idea what kind of medicine would work on an alien. No idea if human bandages would stick to her silver skin, or if human painkillers would help or hurt her, but he did his best anyway, cleaning the worst of her wounds with antiseptic and wrapping them in clean white bandages and trying to make her comfortable with his only pillow and his only blanket. For 3 days, Danny watched over her, barely sleeping himself, checking her breathing every few hours and dripping water into her mouth when she seemed able to swallow, talking to her in a soft voice, even though he was sure she could not understand him, telling her about Earth and about his life and about the stars outside the window, just to fill the silence when she finally opened her eyes on the 3rd day. Those beautiful silver eyes that looked like twin moons rising over a calm ocean. Danny smiled at her and said the only thing that seemed right to say, "Hey there. You are safe now. Everything is going to be okay." She did not understand his words, but somehow she understood his meaning, and when she reached out and touched his rough hand with her delicate fingers, Danny felt something pass between them that needed no translation at all. The princess revealed the fleet arrived on the 7th day, appearing out of nowhere in a flash of golden light that made Danny shield his eyes and stumble backward from the viewport. And when he could see again, he found himself staring at something that made his small salvage ship look like a toy floating next to a mountain warships. Dozens of them, each one larger and more beautiful than anything humanity had ever built. Their hulls gleaming with that same strange golden glow he had seen in the wreckage. Danny's first thought was that he was about to die, that these aliens had come to destroy the witness to their existence and take back their injured crew member and erase any evidence that they had ever been in this part of space. But then his communication system crackled to life, and a voice spoke to him in perfect English, asking permission to send a shuttle to retrieve their lost one. He said yes, because what else could he say? And within minutes, a small golden craft had docked with the HFY Wanderer, and figures in flowing robes were stepping through his airlock, tall and silver-skinned like the woman he had saved, their eyes wide with an emotion he could not quite write as they looked around at his cluttered cargo bay and his patched walls and his simple, human face. They spoke to the woman in a language that sounded like music, like wind chimes and flowing water all mixed together. And she answered them in the same tongue, her voice weak but clear. And Danny stood off to the side, feeling awkward and out of place in his own ship, not understanding a word of what was being said, but knowing somehow that it was important. One of the aliens, an older male with lines around his eyes and silver hair cropped short, turned to Danny and bowed deeply in a gesture that seemed formal and respectful. And then he spoke in that same perfect English and said something that made Danny's knees feel weak, human. "You have saved the life of Princess Valith Ara Sunborn, 3rd daughter of High Emperor Kelthos, ruler of the Celestine Dominion, which spans 40,000 star systems across the galaxy. And for this, you have our eternal gratitude. Danny did not know what to say to that, had never expected anything like that. Had just been doing what seemed right at the time, without any thought of who she might be or what reward might come from saving her. And so he just nodded and said the only thing that came to his mind. "I'm glad I could help." She seemed like she needed it. The aliens exchanged looks with each other, their silver eyes communicating something that Danny could not understand. And then they carefully lifted the princess from his cot and carried her toward the airlock. And Danny thought that was the end of it. Thought they would leave, and he would never see any of them again, and would spend the rest of his life wondering if it had all been some strange dream. But then the princess spoke, her voice carrying across the cargo bay in English now. Weak but determined. "Wait, I must know. What do you want in return for saving my life?" Danny blinked at her, confused by the question, because it had never occurred to him to want anything. And he shrugged his shoulders and said, "Nothing. I do not need anything. I am just glad you are okay now." The aliens stared at him like he had spoken in some language they could not comprehend, like he had said something impossible or insane. And the princess herself looked at him with those moon-silver eyes full of an emotion he could not name, and then they were gone. The golden shuttle detaching from his ship and flying back to the fleet that hung in space. Like a constellation of new stars, Danny watched them go. Watched the fleet turn and vanish in another flash of golden light. And then he sat down heavily in his pilot chair and let out a long breath and tried to understand what had just happened to him. This simple salvage worker from a small planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, across the void, aboard the flagship of the Celestin fleet. Princess Velith Era was carried to the medical bay where the finest doctors in the Dominion worked to heal her wounds properly. And as she lay on the soft bed surrounded by concerned faces and beeping machines, she could not stop thinking about the human. About Danny Cole and his rough hands and his tired smile and the way he had asked for nothing. And all the High Council was summoned to hear her account of the rescue. Ancient beings who had lived for thousands of years and had seen empires rise and fall and had negotiated treaties with hundreds of different species across the galaxy. And they listened with growing confusion as she described how the human had found her, saved her, cared for her, and then simply let her go without any demand for payment or reward. "He must want something," said Counselor Rendell, his voice skeptical and sharp. "All beings want something. It is the nature of existence. Perhaps he was too intimidated by our fleet to state his demands. Or perhaps he plans to use this debt against us in the future," said Counselor Lithana, her eyes narrow with suspicion. Humans are new to the galactic stage. They may be more cunning than they appear. But Velithera shook her head and said, "No. You do not understand. He truly wanted nothing. He gave me food from his own supplies when he had little to spare. He gave me his only blanket and slept on the cold metal floor. He talked to me in his soft voice for 3 days, even though he knew I could not understand his words. And when I tried to give him a bracelet of moonstone as payment, he pushed it back into my hands and told me I needed it more than he did." The council fell silent at this, unable to process what they were hearing, because in the Celestin Dominion and in every other civilization they had ever encountered, debts were sacred things, obligations that bound beings together across time and space. And a favor given freely, without expectation of return, was something that simply did not exist in their understanding of how the universe worked. Emperor Kalthos himself came to see his daughter that evening, sitting beside her bed and holding her hand and listening as she told him everything about the human and his kindness. And when she was finished, he sat in silence for a long time, his ancient face thoughtful and his silver eyes distant. "This human," he said finally, "this Danny Cole, he has given us something far more valuable than he knows. He has shown us that there are beings in this universe who act not out of self-interest or obligation or fear, but simply because they see someone in need and choose to help. And that is a kind of wealth that cannot be measured in credits or treaties or promises. Valethera nodded, tears forming in her moon-silver eyes as she thought about the simple salvage worker who had changed her understanding of the universe forever. And she made a promise to herself that she would find a way to repay his kindness, not because she was obligated to, but because she wanted to, because he had shown her what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, Danny Cole was already back to work, hauling scrap metal through the asteroid belt in his battered old ship, never knowing that he had become the subject of intense discussion in the halls of power of an empire that spanned 40,000 worlds, never imagining that his simple act of kindness had set in motion events that would change the destiny of his entire species. The search for the human 3 months passed in the golden halls of the Celestine Palace, and in that time, Princess Valethera healed completely from her physical wounds. But there was another kind of wound inside her that refused to close. A strange ache in her chest whenever she thought about the human who had saved her life and wanted nothing in return. And she found herself thinking about him more and more with each passing day. She would wake in the middle of the night from dreams where she was back in his small ship, wrapped in his rough blanket that smelled like engine oil and human sweat, listening to him hum those strange Earth songs while he cooked that terrible bland protein paste that he had shared with her so willingly. And she would lie in her silk sheets in her crystal tower and feel a longing she could not explain. Her sisters noticed the change in her, the way she would stare out the windows at the stars with a distant look in her eyes, the way she had stopped attending parties and diplomatic functions, the way she had started reading everything she could find about the human species and their small blue planet called Earth and their short violent history full of war and suffering, and yet also full of art and music and love. You are thinking about him again, said her eldest sister Caroline, one evening as they walked through the palace gardens, the twin suns setting in shades of purple and gold behind the distant mountains. The human who saved you, Valethera did not deny it. Could not deny it when the truth was written so clearly on her face. And she said, I cannot stop thinking about him, Kira. I have met princes and diplomats and warriors from 1,000 different worlds, beings of power and beauty and ancient wisdom, and yet none of them have ever made me feel the way I felt when that simple human carried me in his arms and told me everything would be okay. Caroline was quiet for a moment, her silver eyes thoughtful as she considered her sister's words. And then she said, perhaps you should find him again. Perhaps you should go to him and discover what it is about this human that has captured your heart so completely. The idea took root in Valethera's mind and grew like a flower reaching for the sun. And within a week, she had gathered the courage to approach her father with a request that she knew would surprise him. She wanted to return to the place where she had been rescued, wanted to find the human called Danny Cole, wanted to give him something that would express the gratitude she felt in a way that mere words could never. Capture Emperor Kalthos. Listen to his daughter's request with the patience of a being who had lived for 10,000 years. And when she was finished, he did not immediately refuse as she had feared he might. But instead he asked her a simple question. What do you intend to give him, my daughter? What gift could possibly repay a debt that the giver himself does not believe exists? Valethera had thought about this question for many sleepless nights, turning over possibilities in her mind like precious stones, considering and rejecting 1,000 different ideas until she had finally found the one that felt right. And she told her father what she wanted to give the human, and watched his ancient eyes widen with surprise and then narrow with thought and then finally soften with understanding. This is a great gift you propose, he said slowly. A gift that could change the course of their entire civilization. Are you certain this human is worthy of such a thing? I am certain, Valethera said with a conviction that came from somewhere deep inside her. He showed me kindness without motive, generosity without expectation. He gave me everything he had when he had so little to give. And if there is any being in this universe who deserves such a gift, it is him." The Emperor was silent for a long moment, and then he nodded and gave his blessing. And within the day, a Celestin scout ship was prepared for the journey to the Kepler asteroid belt. A small fast vessel crewed by loyal servants who would take the princess wherever she needed to go. The journey took 3 weeks, jumping from one star system to another through the golden gates that connected the far corners of the galaxy. And Velithera spent most of that time alone in her quarters, practicing what she would say to Danny when she finally saw him again, wondering if he would even remember her, wondering if he would understand the significance of what she was about to give him. They found him exactly where they expected to find him, in the same asteroid belt where they had first met. His battered old ship drifting through the debris field with its cargo hold full of scrap metal. And when the golden scout ship appeared beside the Wanderer, Danny's first reaction was confusion followed quickly by fear. He stared at the alien vessel on his viewport, his heart pounding in his chest as he remembered the fleet that had come before. And he thought to himself that maybe they had changed their minds. Maybe they had decided that a human who knew about their existence was too dangerous to leave alive. Maybe this was the end of his short and unremarkable life. But then a message appeared on his communication screen, written in English with a formality that seemed almost old-fashioned, inviting him to come aboard the Celestin vessel to speak with Princess Velithera Sunborn. And Danny read the message 3 times before he believed it was real. He looked down at himself, at his stained jumpsuit and his calloused hands and his unshaven face. And he laughed a little at the absurdity of it all. A princess wanting to see him, wanting to talk to a salvage worker who smelled like engine grease and had not had a proper shower in weeks. But he supposed it would be rude to refuse. He cleaned himself up as best he could, washing his face and hands and putting on the cleanest clothes he owned, which were still not very clean at all. And then he cycled through his airlock and crossed the short distance to the golden ship that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The interior of the Celestin vessel was like nothing he had ever seen. All curves and soft light and materials that seemed to flow like water frozen in mid-motion. And attendants in flowing robes led him through corridors that smelled like flowers and music, if such things could have a smell. Until finally they brought him to a room where Velithera was waiting. She was even more beautiful than he remembered. Her silver blue skin healthy and radiant, her moon-silver eyes bright with an emotion he could not quite name, her white hair flowing down her back like a waterfall of silk. And she was smiling at him in a way that made his chest feel tight and his words get stuck in his throat. "Hello, Danny Cole," she said in that musical voice he had never forgotten. "I have been looking for you." And Danny, who had faced danger and hardship and loneliness for most of his adult life without flinching, found himself suddenly nervous in a way he had never been before. And all he could think to say was, "Hello, princess. I'm glad to see you looking so much better." She laughed at that, a sound like bells ringing in a gentle breeze. And she said, "I came to give you something to thank you for what you did. Something that I hope will show you how much your kindness meant to me and to my people." Danny started to protest, started to say that he did not need anything, that he had not saved her for a reward. But she held up her hand to stop him and said the words that would change everything. "Please, let me give this to you, not as payment, but as a gift, freely given. The way you gave your help to me." And Danny, who had never been very good at accepting things from others, found that he could not refuse her, not when she looked at him with those silver eyes full of hope and gratitude and something else he was afraid to name. The gift beyond measure of Velithera led Danny through the golden corridors of her ship to a small private chamber where the walls seemed to pulse with a soft, warm light. And in the center of the room, on a pedestal made of something that looked like frozen starlight, sat a small cube that glowed with colors Danny had no names for, shifting and changing like a living rainbow contained in a box no bigger than his fist. "What is that?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper, because the cube seemed to demand reverence somehow, seemed to radiate importance in a way that made the air feel thick with meaning. "This," Valithura said, as she lifted the cube gently from its pedestal and cradled it in her hands like a precious child, "is the collected knowledge of the Celestine Dominion. 10,000 years of science and medicine and engineering. Everything my people have learned in our long journey through the stars, compressed into a form that your people can understand and use." Danny stared at the cube, his mind struggling to comprehend what she was telling him, because this was not a gift in any normal sense of the word. This was not credits or technology or even a planet of his own. This was something so vast and valuable that he could not even begin to calculate its worth. "I do not understand," he said slowly. "Why would you give something like this to me? I am nobody. I am just a salvage worker who happened to be in the right place at the right time." Valithura smiled at him with a tenderness that made his heart ache, and she said, "That is exactly why I am giving it to you, Danny. Because you are the kind of person who sees themselves as nobody, even when they have done something extraordinary. Because you did not save me for glory or reward, but simply because it was the right thing to do." She held out the cube toward him, and Danny hesitated for a long moment, his rough hands hovering over the glowing object as his mind raced through all the implications of what accepting this gift would mean, not just for him, but for his entire species. "Inside this cube," Valithura continued, her voice soft and earnest, "you will find medical knowledge that can cure any disease your people suffer from, including the ones that have claimed so many of your lives throughout your history. You will find engineering principles that will allow you to build ships that can travel between stars in days instead of years. You will find agricultural techniques that will end hunger on your world forever." Danny's hands began to shake slightly as he thought about his sister Maria back on Earth, lying in a hospital bed fighting a disease that the doctors said could not be cured. Thought about all the people in the colonies who went to sleep hungry every night. Thought about all the dreams of exploration and discovery that humanity had been forced to abandon, because the universe was simply too big and too far away. "This is too much," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I cannot accept something like this. It is worth more than anything I could ever give in return." But Valithura shook her head firmly and said, "You already gave something in return. Danny, you gave it before you even knew what you would receive. You gave kindness and compassion and care to a stranger who needed help. And those things are worth more than all the technology in the galaxy." She pressed the cube into his hands, and Danny felt a warmth spread through his fingers and up his arms and into his chest. A feeling like hope and possibility and the first rays of sunlight after a long cold night. And he knew in that moment that his life had changed forever in ways he could not yet imagine. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he asked, looking up at her with eyes that were wet with tears he was trying very hard not to shed. "I do not know anyone important. I do not have any connections to governments or scientists or anyone who could use this properly. You will figure it out," Valithura said with absolute confidence. "That is one of the things I learned about humans in my brief time with you. Your species has a remarkable ability to adapt and overcome and find solutions to problems that seem impossible. And I believe that if anyone can figure out how to share this gift with their entire world, it is you." Danny looked down at the cube in his hands, watching the colors shift and dance inside its crystalline surface. And he thought about what she was asking him to do. Not just to accept a gift, but to become a messenger, a bearer of hope for billions of people who had no idea that their lives were about to change. there is one condition," Valethera said suddenly. And Danny looked up at her with surprise, because she had not mentioned any conditions before. "What condition?" he asked, his voice wary because in his experience, gifts with conditions attached were usually not really gifts at all, but Valethera just smiled and said, "You must share this knowledge freely with all of your people. Not sell it to the highest bidder. Not keep it for yourself or your country, but give it to everyone equally. The way you gave your help to me, without asking who I was, or where I came from, or what I could give you in return." Danny laughed at that. A real laugh that came from somewhere deep in his belly, because the condition she was asking for was no condition at all. It was simply asking him to be the person he had always been. The person who saw helping others as its own reward. "I think I can manage that," he said, with a smile that felt brighter than any smile he had worn in years. Valethera reached out and took his hand in hers, her silver skin cool and smooth against his rough calloused palm, and she said, "I know you can, Danny. I knew it from the moment you carried me out of that wreckage without asking for anything. From the moment you gave me your only blanket and slept on the cold floor. From the moment you told me everything would be okay, even though you had no way of knowing if that was true." They stood there for a long moment, hand in hand, two beings from worlds so different they might as well have been from separate universes, connected by an act of kindness that had crossed the vast emptiness between stars. "Will I ever see you again?" Danny asked, surprised by how much he wanted the answer to be yes. Valethera squeezed his hand gently and said, "I hope so. Danny Cole, I truly hope so. But even if we never meet again, I want you to know that you have changed my life forever. You have shown me that the universe is bigger and more wonderful than I ever imagined. And I will carry the memory of your kindness with me for the rest of my very long life." Danny nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and then slowly, reluctantly, he let go of her hand and stepped back, clutching the glowing cube to his chest. Like the treasure it was, the journey back to Earth would take months in his slow human ship. Months of staring at the stars and thinking about everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen. But Danny did not mind the long journey ahead. He had something important to do. Something that mattered more than anything he had ever done in his life. And for the first time in a very long time, Danny Cole felt like he had a purpose as the Wanderer pulled away from the golden Celestin vessel. Danny looked back one last time and saw Valethera standing at a viewport, her silver hand raised in farewell, her moon-silver eyes bright with tears that she did not try to hide, and Danny raised his own hand in return. A simple gesture between two souls who had found something precious in each other, something that distance and time could never take away. Humanity's place among the stars. The Wanderer touched down on Earth 4 months after Danny left the Kepler belt, landing at a small spaceport in Nevada, where nobody paid much attention to a battered old salvage ship, piloted by a man who looked like he had not slept properly in weeks. And Danny walked off his ship with the glowing cube hidden inside his jacket, pressed against his heart like a secret too big to speak aloud. His first stop was the hospital in Phoenix, where his sister, Maria, had been fighting her illness for the past 2 years. And when he walked into her room and saw her lying there pale and thin with tubes running in and out of her arms, he almost broke down crying right there in the doorway. "Danny," she said, her voice weak, but her eyes lighting up with surprise and joy at seeing her brother after so many months away. "What are you doing here? I thought you were working out in the belt." He sat down beside her bed and took her hand in his. And he said, "I brought you something, Maria. Something that is going to make you better. Something that is going to change everything." She looked at him with confusion and concern, probably thinking that the loneliness of space had finally driven him crazy. But then he pulled out the cube and showed it to her, and even though she had no idea what it was, she could see in his eyes that whatever had happened to him out there in the darkness between stars had been real, and Important and true, the doctors did not believe him at first when he tried to explain what the cube contained. Dismissed him as a madman or a con artist or someone who had simply been alone too long. But then he showed them how the cube worked, how it responded to questions and displayed information in ways that human technology could not possibly replicate. And their skepticism turned to wonder, and then to excitement, and then to something that looked almost like fear. Within a week, the cube was in the hands of the United Nations, studied by the greatest scientists and doctors and engineers on the planet. And Danny made sure that everyone understood the condition that came with the gift. It must be shared freely with all of humanity, not hoarded by any one nation or corporation or group. Some people fought against this, of course, tried to argue that such valuable technology should be controlled and regulated and doled out carefully. But Danny stood firm in front of cameras and councils and crowds of angry, important people. And he told them the story of how he had received the gift, of the princess who had given it to him, of the simple act of kindness that had started everything. She gave this to me because I helped her without asking for anything in return, he said in front of the General Assembly, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. And she asked only one thing of me in return, that I share it with everyone equally. And that is exactly what I intend to do. The vote was close, closer than it should have been. But in the end, humanity chose to honor the spirit of the gift. And within a year, the knowledge contained in the cube was being distributed to every country on Earth, translated into every language, made available to anyone who wanted to learn. The changes came faster than anyone had expected, like a dam breaking and flooding a valley that had been dry for too long. And within 5 years, the world that Danny had grown up in was almost unrecognizable. Maria was one of the first to be cured. The alien medical knowledge, providing treatments that human doctors had never imagined. And she cried in Danny's arms when the doctors told her she was healthy, really truly healthy. For the first time in years, the diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries began to disappear one by one. Cancer and heart disease and diabetes and all the other things that had stolen so many lives for so long. Cured by techniques that seemed like magic, but were just science from a civilization that had 10,000 more years to figure things out. The colonies on Mars and the Moon stopped struggling to survive and started to thrive, fed by agricultural methods that could grow food in any environment. And new colonies began to spring up on distant moons and asteroids, places that had been too far away and too hostile to consider before. And then came the ships. Beautiful new vessels built with Celestine engineering principles. Ships that could travel between stars in days instead of decades. And suddenly, the galaxy that had always seemed so impossibly vast became a neighborhood that humanity could explore. Danny watched all of this happen from the sidelines, refusing the titles and honors that people tried to give him, declining the offers to lead committees and organizations and movements, because he knew that he was not a leader or a hero. He was just a salvage worker who had done what anyone should do when they see someone in need. The Celestine Dominion watched from their golden worlds as humanity spread across the stars. And they were amazed by what they saw, amazed by how quickly the humans adapted and grew and changed, amazed by how they shared the gift with each other instead of fighting over it the way so many other species had done when Earth finally petitioned to join the galactic community as a full member. The vote was unanimous, and the ceremony was held on a space station built halfway between Earth and the nearest Celestine world. A meeting place that symbolized the new relationship between two civilizations that had once been strangers. Danny was asked to speak at the ceremony, to represent humanity before the gathered delegates of 1,000 different species. And he almost said no because public speaking had never been his strength, and he still did not think of himself as anyone special. But then he thought about Valithara, about her silver eyes and her gentle voice, and the way she had believed in him even when he did not believe in himself. And he knew that he could not refuse. He stood before a crowd of billions, watching not just in person but on screens across 100 worlds. Humans and aliens alike all waiting to hear what he would say. And for a long moment he just stood there in silence, looking out at all those faces full of hope and curiosity and expectation. And then he spoke, his voice quiet but steady, amplified by technology so that every being in that vast audience could hear him clearly. 10 years ago, I was just a salvage worker, he said, flying through an asteroid belt, looking for scrap metal to sell, and then I found someone who needed help. And I helped her, not because I expected a reward, not because I knew who she was, but simply because it was the right thing to do. He paused, remembering that moment in the wreckage when he had first seen Velithera lying there bleeding and broken, remembering how he had not hesitated even for a second before deciding to save her. That is all I did, he continued. I saw someone in need and I helped, and I believe that is something any human would have done. Because despite all our flaws and all our mistakes and all the times we have failed to live up to our own ideals, at our core, we are a species that cares about others, that reaches out to help even when there is nothing in it for us. He looked out at the crowd, at the humans and the Celestin and the dozens of other species he had never seen before, and he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. So I do not stand before you as a hero, he said. I stand before you as a representative of a species that has always believed that kindness is its own reward, that helping others is not a transaction but a gift, and that the measure of a civilization is not what it takes but what it gives. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing off the walls of the great chamber and rolling through the station like a wave. But Danny barely heard it because his eyes had found a familiar face in the crowd, a face with silver blue skin and moon-silver eyes, and a smile that made his heart soar. Velithera was there, standing among the Celestin delegation, and when their eyes met across that vast distance, she raised her hand in a small wave. The same gesture she had made when they had parted ways so many years ago, and Danny smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes and warmed his soul, because he knew now that some gifts are beyond measure, and some kindnesses echo through eternity. And sometimes a simple act of compassion from a nobody can change the destiny of worlds. The galaxy had never seen anything quite like humanity before, and standing there in that moment, surrounded by the representatives of 1,000 civilizations, Danny Cole finally understood that perhaps that was exactly as it should be.